Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video. For this video, we're going to be talking about Dogen Zenji on the point, based on the reading that I assigned for you this week, both of them relatively short, Actualizing the Fundamental Points by Dogen and Birth and Death, also by Dogen. So we're going to start off with a little short contextualization of Dogen, who he is as a philosopher, why it is that we are, kind of interrupting our Socrates sequence to, maybe get a new, fresh perspective before we dive back into some more Plato and look at the Phaedo, where, Socrates will actually suffer his execution. For today, we're switching things up, and we're, instead of analyzing Western philosophy, we're analyzing Eastern philosophy. Specifically, in this case, we're looking at Japanese philosopher. Dogen was the founder of the Soto school of Zen Buddhism in the 13th century in Japan. It's worth attending to a few particularities about this explanation. The first is that, by the way, we should just refer to Dogen as Dogen. Um, Japanese is unlike English in that the family name is displayed first, right? So, it's not a mark of disrespect or something like that we're talking about Dogen rather than, Zenji, like the way that we talk about Kant instead of Emmanuel. That's, perfectly okay. So that's one feature of the Japanese language that's, worth taking a second to appreciate, just because we otherwise might think that we're referring to Dogen's first name all the time, but that's not really the case, right? But then, moreover, he was the founder of a certain sect of what is known as Zen Buddhism. You've all probably become familiar with the idea of Zen Buddhism in some form or another, probably through, kind of media representations of Zen Buddhism. And it's actually for that reason that I think it's really productive to focus on some of the problems of this philosopher in this philosophical period, and the way that philosophical problems, questions come up in Buddhist ways of philosophizing, as opposed to the traditional ancient Greek perspective that we've mostly focused on up to this point. Now, this might be review somewhat for some of you, but Buddhism is a religion, it's a philosophy that emerges out of the activity of the actual historical Buddha, right? There was a Buddha in the same way that there is a Socrates, and this happened in a way that is roughly contemporaneous with, Socrates and Plato and that content that we're reading together. And then slowly over time, the sect of philosophical and religious belief spreads outward from India, northward into China, and then from China eventually to Japan. Now, while I mentioned that the tradition of Buddhism is in some ways quite old, at least as old as the Plato material that we were reading together, Dogen himself actually wrote in the 13th century, right? So we are much closer to Dogen than Dogen was to Socrates and Plato, where the trial of Socrates took place in 399 BC. So, importantly, Dogen, we're not exactly looking at like ancient philosophy in the same way that we would think about Plato as a kind of ancient philosophy, but certainly it follows Buddhism, which itself is a very old philosophical tradition. And as far as historical sources for philosophy, the 13th century is really, still quite old in most cases. Actually, if you're not reading the ancient Greeks, then I think that the average, practitioner of philosophy in the Western world doesn't really deal with material mostly over a few hundred years old. In particular, older than the early modern period of philosophy. So, while Dogen was in no way, contemporaneous with Socrates and his ilk, right? He still was writing, quite some long time before, quite a lot of cultural distance between us and Dogen that is worth appreciating. Now, before we talk about Zen as a specific sect of Buddhism, I think it's helpful to introduce some terms. I'm actually going to go out of order here. Let's start with the first one, as if we're going in order. Nirvana. This is a word depicting the process of enlightenment, right? The traditional Buddhist conception is that life itself is suffering. This is one of the great noble truths of the Buddhist tradition. And to realize, to become enlightened, to reach nirvana, is to no longer suffer, and so therefore to no longer recur in this world, right? Um, a lot of Buddhist descriptions of suffering and Buddhist descriptions of the external world often depict it as an essentially cyclical process, right? In what way they mean by this? Well, we form attachments to things in the world, the objects of our desire, the things that we want and need to go well in our lives, right? And the nature of reality is such that our attachments to this world are regularly thwarted, right? And then we experience pain, as when I become attached to some, big shiny commodity, my new iPhone, whatever, right? I drop the iPhone, it shatters, and now, I'm heartbroken, obviously. And there are less silly ways of describing the way that we become attached to the world, and, maybe ways that are more sympathetic to the idea of getting attached to the world, right? Like having a child, for example. You become attached to the idea that you would really like this child to do well, to live a happy life, to succeed in the world, and to build a world where that is in some way, possible. And so the Buddhist conception really is that you should attempt to eliminate desire so as to eliminate your attachment to the world, and therefore to reduce the amount of suffering that you have to experience. And so in that way it's very similar to Stoicism, right? The way that we might think about a Stoic person as someone who is indifferent to circumstance. Now, as I said, going out of order, going to this last term, this is Buddha Dharma, right? This is going to come up in our reading a few times this week. And so it's helpful if you know what this term means. And really, it's just a term for fundamental reality, right? So, many times the way the Buddhist texts are written is they'll say things like, you will see things like a Buddha if you see things in such and such way, right? And what does that mean? Well, it means you will see things correctly. You will see things how they are. You will see things truly, adequately, from a perspective that allows you to see the truth in one way or another. Now, I said that Dogen was the founder of the Soto school of Zen Buddhism. You might think from my previous description of Buddhist philosophy that preventing yourself from being attached to the world, preventing your attachments, is a very difficult thing, right? We spontaneously become attached to the world. We feel desire, right? And this desire is characteristic of many aspects of our mental waking lives. And since Buddhism sees as its goal the realization of nirvana, hence enlightenment, hence the true realization of Buddha Dharma, there is significant disagreement concerning the right way to make that happen, right? If enlightenment is us no longer being attached to the world, then you might rightfully ask, well, how do we do that, right? That sounds like a very, Herculean, difficult task, right? So, how does, the Zen master teach people how to disabuse themselves of these attachments? And for the most part, there are kind of two favored techniques. There are what are known as koans, and there is what is known as zazen. Now, a koan is something like a paradoxical poem, right? These were sayings that oftentimes were passed down either from the Buddha or from Madhyamaka Buddhism in India in some capacity or another. And the idea was, well, the Buddha was wise. The Buddha had certain things to say to us as, those seeking enlightenment, those philosophers, right? And so if we just attend to precisely what it is that the Buddha wanted to communicate to us, then we can reach enlightenment. In the koan, it isn't just like a saying, right? It's not like something on a fortune cookie. It's not like a go out and do good or something like that, right? But it's something. It's a poem or a saying that is intended to cause a kind of spiritual transformation, right? The idea is not just that you log some kind of information of some kind. Oh, the Buddha said this, right? The point is that the very paradoxical nature of the statement will itself make you reevaluate not just particular things that you happen to believe, but your whole system of beliefs, right? And so this was the belief on the part of the Rinzai school that passing down these sayings and doing them correctly is, the best way of teaching new people to reach enlightenment, right? Now, so Zazen is sort of the competing technique for reaching enlightenment, and it is in fact Dogen's own favored technique for reaching enlightenment. And what Zazen is thoughtless meditation, right? So the idea is that enlightenment as a spiritual process doesn't come from knowing stuff, right? Like, if you are, say, like a professor and you have this really, really detailed knowledge of what it is that the Buddha, in fact, happened to say, that doesn't necessarily mean for these thinkers that you're actually wise. It doesn't mean that you've reached enlightenment, right? Part of what we need to appreciate about the Rinzai school, and the point that they had at least, is that the koan is meant to, in a way, indirectly cause you to reach enlightenment, right? Through saying something paradoxical, you kind of realize the superfluousness of all of this stuff, right? And then that is what leads you to enlightenment. But what Dogen witnessed, what caused him to argue for this transformation of the Buddhist tradition into what we know as the Soto school, which is the largest surviving school of Zen Buddhism, is that he felt that the Rinzai school and the way that the technique was utilized there was too dogmatic. It's too doctrinal, right? It seemed too much like if you just say the right answer to this question or whatever, that you've really solved the riddle and that therefore you are truly wise, right? And what Dogen had to say about this is that wisdom, enlightenment, almost never comes at the moment of theoretical reflection, right? It's not when you are really caught up in knowing stuff that you are really actualizing true wisdom, but he thinks that you're actualizing true wisdom when you're like living your life, in real, immediate, practical activity is when you reach true enlightenment, right? When you're so wrapped up in something that you are totally one with that activity, where you feel no before or after. It feels like that is really what you are wrapped up in at that point, right? A lot of contemporary Buddhists compare this to athletes whenever they get into the zone, right? There's a certain kind of performance that takes place when somehow or another, right? We don't have a detailed account of why you're able to put the past behind you, put the future behind you, right? In a way, really dedicate yourself to the moment that's happening right now, right? And so, what Zazen as a technique is meant to do is you'll be in meditation for long enough to empty yourself entirely of all of your thoughts, all of your worries, your attachments, your dismays, etc., through a kind of practice. Dogen thought you can have your share, of enlightenment, and the suffering that is involved in attachment and desire melts away in those very precise, ecstatic moments. This is a very different way of thinking than is, typical in the Western hemisphere, right? Essentially, especially since like Christianity, right? Religions were distinguished by what it is that they believed, right? Do you believe in the reincarnation of Jesus Christ or not? Do you believe in the Trinity or not? Do you believe, in these rituals or not, right? And what's important about Buddhism is that Buddhism is not doctrinally oriented like that in any way at all, right? One of the most famous koans that would be, shared would be that if you see the Buddha on the road, you have to kill him, right? The idea is true wisdom doesn't consist in repeating what you take to be the right answer, right? Just because that is the Buddha on the road or whatever doesn't mean that you should venerate and adore him, simply because he's the Buddha, right? To the contrary, the reason why, Buddhism has any value is because it's a process that everyone goes through on their own and has to, in a certain way, transform themselves. They had to transform their outlook towards the world and encounter it in a different way, right? Hence, many of Dogen's central works are about things that are absolutely unthinkable to Western philosophers, right? He has texts on meditation. He has texts on, eating from the same dish. He has texts on washing the dishes. He has texts on sweeping, on doing your housework correctly, right? These are exactly the sort of things that, most traditional Western philosophy is just like, yeah, whatever. That's like common sense BS, and I don't have any part to play in it, right? I don't relate to that everyday reality, right? That's almost what these Western philosophers are kind of admitting. Whereas Dogen says to the contrary, that those moments of practice, those are who you really are, right? Those are the moments of your greatest awakening. And even if they aren't these uber reflective moments, that they are the closest that you really get to enlightenment, right? So let's read some passages to see why it is that he says that that's the case. So let's move over to this right column here. And I have two long quotations. The first is from Actualizing the Fundamental Point, and the second is from Birth and Death. Okay, let's go through the first one. Quote, to carry the self forward and illuminate myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening. So already you can kind of see this really, to some degree, kind of humble aspect of Dogen's philosophy, right? When you carry the self forward, when you apply your own categories to reality and you think, well, because I'm like this, things have to be a certain way, then you're deluded, right? For example, when I think, oh, I don't know, I'm gonna get this job because I really want this job, right? Or something like that, which is, typical for Dogen of how we think when we are desiring, then we are in delusion, right? We want to change the world, we want to apply our own categories, our own self to the world, right? And that is fruitless, right, for Dogen's perspective. But that myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening, right? When I don't rush out to apply my own knowledge, my categories to existent reality, but instead I open myself to the way that the things can illuminate and awaken me, then this constitutes what he calls awakening, right? And he further says that those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Right? So we can see already, being a Buddha is not never being in delusion, it's not always being right, but it's having great realization of delusion, right? Whereas those who are greatly deluded about realization, like Socrates said in some ways, those who think they have realization but are really deluded are sentient beings. And importantly, there's little ellipses here. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily know that they are Buddhas. And afterwards, we get this really wonderful metaphor of the moon illuminated in the water, right? And it's important because the moon that's illuminated in the water is a reflection of the actual moon, right? But it doesn't share all of the qualities and characteristics of the moon, for example, right? And so the Buddha is someone who can accurately reflect reality, can reflect our experience and what it is like, right? Including our delusions, right? But doesn't actually share in those delusions. I think that, this leaves open quite a lot to interpretation, but, you can see clearly that it's in meditation, it's in those moments where you're really wrapped up in what you're doing, where you're fully present, that Dogen thinks, that precise moment of the emptiness of all knowledge, that is nirvana. That is true wisdom, right? He says furthermore, and this is on the second to last page of actualizing the fundamental point. He says what the point is, right? He says, when you find your place where you are, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point, right? Finding the place where you are, not yearning for the future or the past or for some other world that would be more consummate with your desires, right? Instead, realizing the place where you are. That is what it means to actualize the fundamental point. Hence, the point is always found in practice, which is meditation, right? Which happens in Zazen, in the practice of, trying to clear yourself of all thoughts. But that meditative activity also takes place when you're doing your daily stuff, right? If you're an athlete, it happens when you're running. If you're like me, it happens like when you're doing the chores or when you're being loving or, something like that. Those moments where you're missing nothing, right? That's when you are truly Buddha for Dogen. And importantly, this means, in a certain sense, in a way that I think we can fruitfully compare to Socrates, that you must release yourself from the fear of birth and death, right? Of coming into life and of going out of life. Hence, the natural connection between actualizing the fundamental point, being where you are in practice, finding the place where you are, right? And not fearing these places that you are not, right? Birth and death. So here is a long quote from the second one as well. Quote, "There is a simple way to become a Buddha. When you refrain from unwholesome actions, are not attached to birth and death, and are compassionate towards all sentient beings, respectful to seniors and kind to juniors, not excluding or desiring, or desiring anything with no thoughts or worries, you will be called a Buddha. Seek nothing else," right? And note that all of these activities that Dogen says to become a Buddha, none of them are premised in any way on the future. They are all things that you can do immediately. Refrain from unwholesome actions, right? Not go into the past and prevent yourself from having made a mistake, but to refrain now from unwholesome actions, to remove yourself of the attachment to birth and death, to be compassionate towards all other sentient beings is also being in the cycle of birth and death, and therefore you'll be respectful to those who are above you in social position, kind to those who are below you, and therefore you're not seeking to exclude or desire anything. Hence the completeness of this individual moment. With no thoughts or worries, you will be called a Buddha, right? Nothing else that you seek in the world is something that you can practice and realize in an immediate way, and that misses nothing, right? If I want to make money, there's always more money to be made. If I want to, achieve fame, there are always things that I could have done better that now I regret because, it led to an outcome that I didn't want. But if you release yourself of these attachments from the past and from the future, then Dogen claims you can feel a kind of total completeness that is worthy of the name of enlightenment. I think Dogen is really fascinating thinker. I think that Dogen can be productively put into conversation with a lot of stuff that we've read, like Kant and like Socrates. And I very much look forward to hearing what you all think. Thank you so much. I hope that you have a great week. Bye bye.